Having demolished rationalist foundations of ethics, Hume needs an alternative account of morality. If morality doesn't come from reason, and you can't derive ought from is, where do moral judgments come from? His answer: sentiment. Specifically, sentiments of approval and disapproval that naturally arise when we observe actions and character traits. Morality is fundamentally about feelings, not facts or rational principles. When we call an action virtuous or vicious, we're expressing a sentiment of approval or disapproval, not discovering an objective moral fact. Hume begins his analysis by noting that we make moral judgments. We are responding to something real. We observe actions and their consequences. We perceive character traits and their effects. We witness behavior and its impact on human welfare. But the moral quality itself, the virtue or vice, the rightness or wrongness, isn't observed like physical properties. When you see someone helping an elderly person cross the street, you observe the physical movements, the elderly person's need, the helpful action, the successful crossing. But the goodness of the action isn't an additional observable property. You don't see goodness the way you see movement. Rather, you feel approval. The moral quality is your response to what you observe, not a feature of what you observe. This makes Hume's ethics what modern philosophers call non-cognitive or expressivist, though these terms came later. Moral judgments don't report facts, but express sentiments. When you say helping others is virtuous, you're outstating a fact like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. You're expressing approval of helping behavior, perhaps recommending that others approve of it too. This doesn't make moral judgments meaningless or arbitrary, but it does make them subjective in an important sense. They're grounded in human emotional responses rather than independent moral facts.
But Hume doesn't think this leads to extreme relativism or nihilism. While moral sentiments are subjective responses rather than objective facts, they're not arbitrary or completely variable. Human nature is sufficiently uniform that we share certain moral sentiments. The most important is sympathy, the capacity to feel concern for others' welfare, to be pleased by their pleasure and pained by their suffering. Sympathy isn't pure altruism or selflessness, but it's a natural emotional mechanism that allows us to resonate with others' experiences. When we see someone in pain, we feel discomfort. When we see someone happy, we feel pleasure. This sympathetic resonance creates shared moral responses. Because humans are similar in their natures and needs, and because sympathy allows us to feel concern for others, we tend to approve of actions that promote human welfare and disapprove of actions that cause harm. We admire courage because it enables people to overcome fear and act beneficially. We despise cruelty because it causes unnecessary suffering. We value honesty because it facilitates cooperation and trust. We condemn betrayal because it destroys relationships and harms those who trusted. These moral sentiments aren't arbitrary preferences like taste in food. They're stable human responses to features of actions and characters that consistently affect human well-being. Hume places particular emphasis on utility, usefulness in promoting human welfare. We approve of qualities that are useful or agreeable, either to the person possessing them or to others. Honesty is useful because it facilitates cooperation. Generosity is agreeable to those who receive it. Intelligence is useful to the person who possesses it. Wit is agreeable to others. Because of this utility emphasis, Hume is sometimes called a proto-utilitarian. But Hume's position is more complex than simple utilitarianism. He recognizes that we approve of some qualities for their immediate agreeableness rather than for their consequences, and he allows that moral sentiments can be shaped by social conventions and cultural practices.
This leads to Hume's account of justice as an artificial virtue, one of his most important but potentially confusing ideas.
Natural virtues like benevolence and compassion arise directly from human nature and sympathy. We naturally feel concern for those close to us, and we naturally approve of kindness. But justice, respect for property rights, keeping promises, following laws, doesn't arise as naturally. In small groups with plentiful resources, justice is unnecessary. People just share freely and trust others to be generous. But in larger societies with scarce resources, conflicts arise. Whose property is this? Who gets what? How do we ensure people keep their agreements? Justice is the solution to these coordination problems. We establish conventions about property and contracts, and we approve of following these conventions because we recognize they're necessary for social cooperation. Justice is artificial, not because it's fake or arbitrary, but because it depends on human conventions rather than arising directly from natural sentiment. The specific rules of justice vary across societies: what counts as legitimate property, how contracts work, which promises are binding. But the general principle that we need agreed-upon rules for social cooperation is universal. Once the rules are established, we approve of following them and disapprove of violating them because we recognize their utility for social order. Hume's sentiment-based ethics faces several challenges. First, if morality is based on feelings, what about people whose feelings are different? Psychopaths lack normal moral sentiments. They don't feel empathy or guilt. Does morality not apply to them? Humes might respond that psychopaths are moral defectives, like people born without sight are visual defectives. Just as we don't conclude that colors aren't real because some people are colorblind, we shouldn't conclude morality isn't real because some people lack moral sentiments. But this response seems to assume that certain moral sentiments are the correct ones, which seems to reintroduce a kind of objectivity.
Second, if moral judgments express sentiments rather than stating facts, can they be true or false? This leads to complex meta-ethics debates about moral cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. If moral claims aren't fact-stating, they can't be literally true or false. Yet we certainly argue about moral questions as if we're debating truths. Hume's position requires explaining what moral disagreement consists in if it's not disagreement about facts. Third, sentiment-based ethics struggles to explain moral obligation. We don't just approve of virtuous actions, we feel they're required, obligatory, binding. Where does this normative force come from if morality is just a sentiment? Hume can say that we have strong feelings about certain actions, that we desire others to act in certain ways, but the feeling of obligation, the sense that one must do something regardless of what one wants, seems to go beyond mere sentiment. Despite these challenges, Hume's sentiment-based approach has been enormously influential. Emotivism in the 20th century developed his expressivist insights. Moral psychology has confirmed that moral judgment centrally involves emotional processing. Evolutionary accounts trace moral sentiments to adaptations promoting cooperation. Neuroscience has identified the emotional systems underlying moral judgment. Contemporary moral philosophers increasingly recognize that purely rationalist accounts of ethics face serious problems that Hume identified centuries ago.
Now we reach Hume's most radical claim, one that challenges our most fundamental assumption about ourselves. There is no self. Or, more precisely, there is no unified, continuing self that persists through time as the subject of our experiences. What we call the self is really just a bundle of perceptions, a stream of thoughts, sensations, emotions, and memories with no underlying unity. The bundle theory of the self undermines our most basic conviction that there is an I experiencing our experiences, thinking our thoughts, performing our actions. Hume arrives at this shocking conclusion through his characteristic empiricist method. Look at your experience and see what's actually there. When Descartes sought absolute certainty, he concluded, "I think, therefore I am." The existence of the thinking self was the one indubitable truth. But Hume examines his own experience and finds no such self. He writes, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." What does Hume mean? When you introspect, when you look inward at your own consciousness, what do you actually observe? You observe thoughts, sensations, feelings, memories. You're thinking about something, feeling an emotion, sensing your surroundings, remembering the past. But do you observe the I that's supposedly having these thoughts and feelings? Hume says no. You observe the thoughts, but not a thinker distinct from the thoughts. You observe the feelings, but not a feeler separate from the feelings. The self that's supposed to be having the experiences never appears in experience itself.
The self, Hume concludes, is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. There's no continuous, unchanging self underlying these perceptions. There are only the perceptions themselves, connected by relations of similarity, causation, and contiguity in memory. When you remember yesterday's experiences, there's a causal connection between those past perceptions and your current memory. When you anticipate tomorrow's experiences, your expectation is based on past patterns. These connections create a sense of unity, a feeling that there's a continuous me persisting through time. But this unity is constructed, not discovered. It's a pattern we project onto the stream of experiences, not an independently existing entity. This is deeply counterintuitive. We're so convinced that we exist as continuing selves that Hume's denial seems absurd. Of course I'm the same person today as yesterday, as 10 years ago, as when I was born. But Hume asks, what makes you the same person? Not your body. Your physical substance changes constantly. Cells die and are replaced. Your body at 50 shares almost no physical matter with your body at birth. Not your memories. You can't remember most of your life, and memories are often inaccurate or constructed. Not your psychological traits. Personality, beliefs, desires, and values change dramatically over a lifetime. So what exactly persists? What is the you that remains identical through all these changes? Hume's answer, nothing persists. There is no identical self. There's only a sequence of causally connected mental states. We retrospectively construct a narrative of personal identity. We tell ourselves a story about my life, my experiences, my character, and we reify this narrative construction into an entity called the self. But the self is the story, not the author of the story. It's a useful fiction, psychologically and socially necessary, but not a metaphysical reality.
This has profound implications. If there's no continuing self, personal identity through time is, at best, conventional, at worst, illusory. The person who committed a crime 10 years ago isn't, in a metaphysically strict sense, the same person being punished today. They share causal connections and memory links, but they're not numerically identical. This doesn't mean we shouldn't hold people responsible. Social stability requires treating people as continuing selves, but it undermines the metaphysical justification for punishment and desert. Similarly, if there's no self, prudential concern for your future self becomes puzzling. Why should you sacrifice now for future benefit? The future person you'll become isn't, strictly speaking, you. They're causally connected to you, but they're a distinct bundle of perceptions. You might care about them through psychological connections and projected empathy, just as you might care about other people. But there's no metaphysical unity requiring self-concern. Modern neuroscience has largely vindicated Hume's skepticism about the self. Neuroscientists find no unified self region in the brain. Instead, they find distributed processes, memory systems, sensory processing, emotional responses, executive functions, operating in parallel and interacting in complex ways. The feeling of a unified self is generated by these processes, but there's no central controller, no homunculus inside observing and directing everything. Consciousness appears to be more like what philosopher Daniel Dennett calls multiple drafts, parallel processing streams that create a retrospective sense of unity without any actual unified self.
Split-brain patients provide dramatic evidence for this. When the corpus callosum connecting the brain's two hemispheres is severed to treat severe epilepsy, the two hemispheres can process information independently and even display different preferences and responses. Where is the unified self in a split-brain patient? Each hemisphere seems to have its own stream of consciousness, its own perceptions and responses. This suggests that the unified self we normally experience is a construct made possible by neural integration, not a fundamental fact about consciousness. Buddhist philosophy, particularly the doctrine of anatta, or no self, parallels Hume's conclusions remarkably. Buddhist meditation practices aim to reveal through direct observation what Hume argued philosophically, that careful introspective examination finds no permanent self, only a stream of momentary mental states. Some scholars have explored connections between Hume and Buddhism, though there's no evidence Hume knew Buddhist thought. The convergence suggests that careful introspective analysis, whether philosophical or meditative, tends toward skepticism about the self. Hume himself was somewhat troubled by these conclusions. Near the end of the treatise, in the appendix, he admits that his account of personal identity is unsatisfactory and that he lacks a solution to the problems he's raised. This intellectual honesty is characteristic of Hume. He won't pretend to solve problems he finds genuinely difficult. The self remains mysterious. We feel like unified, continuing beings, but careful examination reveals only bundles of perceptions. The tension remains unresolved, perhaps unresolvable. We can't help experiencing ourselves as selves, even if philosophically and scientifically we have reasons to doubt that the self exists in the way we experience it.
Notice the deep connection between these two claims. Morality, Hume argues, isn't discovered in the world but projected onto it by our sentiments. The self, he argues, isn't discovered in experience but constructed from streams of perceptions. Both are cases where something we take to be fundamental, moral facts, the continuing self, turns out to be a construction of the human mind rather than a feature of objective reality. This connects to Hume's broader philosophical project. Again and again, he shows that what we take to be objective features of reality, causation, necessary connection, moral truths, the unified self, are actually contributions of the mind. We're not passive observers discovering a ready-made world. We're active constructors, imposing patterns, projecting necessities, creating unities. This doesn't mean the world is whatever we want it to be. Our constructions are constrained by experience, shaped by human nature, refined by reason. But it means that the boundary between mind and world is more blurred than we thought. For morality, this is both unsettling and liberating.
Unsettling because we can't appeal to objective moral facts written into the universe. There's no cosmic authority validating our values. But liberating because morality becomes a human project, grounded in shared sentiments and pursued through sympathetic engagement with others' well-being. We don't need metaphysical foundations to care about suffering, to value justice, to build cooperative societies. For the self, Hume's conclusion is similarly double-edged. It's unsettling to think we might not exist as we believe we do, that personal identity is constructed rather than discovered. But it's also liberating to recognize that the self is fluid, changeable, open to reconstruction. We're not stuck with fixed essences. We're dynamic processes, constantly becoming rather than permanently being. These insights remain relevant today. In debates about moral foundations, we still grapple with whether values are discovered or constructed, whether ethics needs objective grounding or can rest on shared human sentiments. In consciousness studies, we still struggle with whether the self is a real entity or a useful fiction, whether personal identity has metaphysical substance or is merely narrative coherence.
Hume doesn't resolve these questions definitively, but he shows us that our most basic assumptions about causation, morality, and the self deserve scrutiny. What seems obvious may be projection. What seems discovered may be constructed. What seems unified may be bundled. This skeptical stance isn't meant to paralyze us, but to make us thoughtful, humble, and aware of the gap between how things appear and how they are.